In my last video, I brought up a questionable bit of Star Wars lore on Wikipedia, and you helped me get to the bottom of it. So today we're going to talk about Sedriss, some translations, and a bit more about lost media. Basically, to recap what I mentioned in that video on Force Weirdos, Executor Sedriss QL's Wikipedia article mentions that he was a descendant of ancient fallen Jedi Ulic Qel-Droma, but the citation it gave for that information referred to the official Star Wars fact file in an entry which didn't exist. Entry SED of Fact File 85, which is neither in that magazine nor mentioned in the index of all fact file entries. Because of the spelling of the title on Wikipedia, I speculated that instead of being made up, it may have just been an article which was included in other languages but never translated to English, although I wasn't particularly convinced. A few commenters and an email linking to a Reddit comment by Mongo Beefhead were able to confirm that this was in fact the case, and the German edition got an entry about Sedriss which had never made it to the English copies of the fact file. This is particularly interesting since there were about 20 whole issues of the English version, which were largely just entries from the Japanese version translated English. But this information about Sedriss seems to largely have been pulled from another source, an unpublished novel/short story by Tom Veitch called Lightsider. I got many comments about my pronunciation of Acclamator in the last video, which I realized when I did it, but I didn't bother re-recording, something which I now regret, so I'm sure I'm going to get at least some comments saying the same thing about Veitch here, but I've heard his name pronounced a few different ways, so I'm just going to stick with Veitch. This story was written in the early 1990s, close to when Sedriss and the other characters featured prominently in Lightsider were introduced in the Dark Empire comics, also written by him. Unfortunately, this novel was never officially released, but copies did start leaking out around the time he sadly died in 2022. I have a copy, so after seeing this comment, I opened it and the passage mentioning Ulic is here. While the novel remains technically non-canon because it was never published, it seems like it is the likely source of the information for whomever wrote this entry in the fact file. But there's another element I want to talk about this here, which was brought up in this comment, and I want to talk briefly about why I disagree with it, without causing a dogpile, which is why I'm not putting the name on the comment. For those too busy to look at their screen to read the comment, or to you specifically, James, who's listening to this with your phone in your pocket so you won't be able to easily like this video and subscribe for more, the comment says, quote, "I scoff at Wikipedia for actually including Lightsider novella lore, but not acknowledging lore from cult and supernatural encounters and so on." I think there's a few key points here. For one, the biggest point is that while the original information may have been expressed in Lightsider, which was cancelled, the citation is from the German edition of the fact file, which was released, even if not in every language. I think different language media is a perfectly reasonable thing for Wikipedia to mention, even if it sometimes causes issues when the information is solely expressed in a translation or something, or when it makes some of the citations look a little bit misleading like what we ran into here. There are plenty of people who primarily read Star Wars in another language, but then contribute or participate in the online community in English. Many of my co-developers for Star Wars Empire War Expanded are Germans, for example, who can read the German material but are then forced to talk to me in English, or if they're feeling adventurous, French. But I don't think it's fair to say that this is a double standard of including some cancelled material but not others. Because again, the citation was for something that wasn't cancelled, and other information from Lightsider is not included in the article. There are many articles which include a cut content section, and I think Lightsider is a good source for information for those sections. But I don't think that's necessarily the case for something like Supernatural Encounters. And I'm sure this is going to get some heat thrown at me. For those unfamiliar, Supernatural Encounters was another potential novella which was being created by Joseph Bongiorno for Hyperspace, the online Star Wars hub, expanding on information from 2 articles he'd written for Star Wars Gamer, which were themselves also never published. As far as I'm aware, the Supernatural Encounters novella was only ever a pitch. It was not something that was, as far as I'm aware again, actually accepted or planned to be published. The author then released a vastly expanded version on his own website, which has been contributed to by others, and is treated by some people as essentially official Legends lore. Ultimately, when it comes to how seriously you want to take particularly unpublished media, that is a personal choice, but for my money, while I'd put the 2 unpublished Gamer articles on a similar standing to Lightsider, I don't think Supernatural Encounters itself is really even at that same level. The novella, again, as far as I know, was simply a pitch, not something that was ever approved, whereas from what we do know, Lightsider was considered a largely finished work, and was intended to be published more or less as it was. It still wasn't, of course, so it is still cut content, but I think that does raise it to the level of cut content rather than proposed content. The same way we wouldn't necessarily take Timothy Zahn's idea that he wanted to write a novel about Ben Skywalker and a clone of Thrawn as actually canon information, even if that does rise to the level of stuff you could note in a behind-the-scenes section. Lightsider in particular, I think, is useful because it was a book by the creator of characters like Kam Solisar and Sedriss, expanding on their backstories, written basically in the midst of when the author was working on them for media which was officially published, which adds helpful contextual information on intent even if it wasn't official. So for that reason, I'd even put Lightsider a few steps above situations where an author may expand on or clarify intent during an interview. This is information that was, at least to some level, approved at some point. And I think the person writing it is important there as well. Supernatural Encounters, while springing from official work initially, went way beyond the scope it was ever intended for in officially licensed publications, and largely involved a different author or set of authors recontextualizing pretty much everything else in Star Wars. While it can be interesting for people who want more expansion of content in the Legends universe, in my mind, that doesn't even really carry the weight required to be mentioned as cut content, since I think the line there is stuff that was at least actually intended to be part of the licensed franchise, which the original Gamer articles did clear, but I don't think Supernatural Encounters does as a whole. To go back to the example about Timothy Zahn's idea for a Ben Skywalker and Thrawn clone novel, stuff that he says about Thrawn or the Chiss can add helpful context. If he had come out and said Sedriss was a descendant of Ula Keldroma in an interview somewhere, I would put less weight on that, since those are characters that he never really had any influence on in published works, so it doesn't really give us any extra information about what might have been behind the published works. Ultimately, none of this is that serious, but this is the kind of thing that I tend to think about when deciding how to present information in these kinds of lore videos. I try to give as much context as I can for stuff, but that's essentially why if I were to do a full lore video about Sedriss, I'd be more likely to reference stuff from Lightsider, even though I would clarify that it was from Lightsider and was therefore cut, than I would be to mention whatever Supernatural Encounters says about a given topic when doing lore videos about whatever Supernatural Encounters talks about, which is basically everything in the Star Wars galaxy to some extent. Let me know what you think about all this, though, and let me know if there's a particular character you would like to see a full deep dive on, and if that includes Sedriss. Thank you to everyone who helped get that information to me, and I hope to see you next time.